Okay, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read some early Lenin today, some Lenin from 1900. This is The War in China by V.I. Lenin. It was written in 1900. Let's go ahead and get into this. Let's see. It was published in Iskra, number 1, December 1900, published according to the Iskra text. Let's go ahead and get into it. Russia is bringing her war with China to a close. A number of military districts have been mobilized. Hundreds of millions of rubles have been spent. Tens of thousands of troops have been dispatched to China. A number of battles have been fought and a number of victories won. True, not so much over regular enemy troops as over Chinese insurgents, and particularly over the unarmed Chinese populace, who were drowned or killed, with no holding back from the slaughter of women and children, not to speak of the looting of palaces, homes, and shops. The Russian government, together with the press that kowtows to it, is celebrating a victory and rejoicing over the fresh exploits of the gallant soldiery, rejoicing at the victory of European culture over Chinese barbarism, and over the fresh successes of Russia's, quote, civilizing mission, end quote, in the Far East. But the voices of the class-conscious workers, of the advanced representatives of the many millions of the working people, are not heard amid this rejoicing. And yet, it is the working people who bear the brunt of the victorious new campaigns. It is working people who are sent to the other end of the world, from whom increased taxes are extorted to cover the millions expended. Let us therefore see, what attitude should the socialists adopt towards this war? In whose interest is it being fought? What is the real nature of the policy now being pursued by the Russian government? Our government asserts, first of all, that it is not waging war against China, that it is merely suppressing a rebellion, pacifying rebels, that it is helping the lawful government of China to reestablish law and order. True, war has not been declared, but this does not change the situation a bit, because war is being waged nonetheless. What made the Chinese attack Europeans? What caused the rebellion which the British, French, Germans, Russians, Japanese, etc. are so zealously crushing? Quote, the hostility of the yellow race towards the white race, end quote. The Chinese hatred, quote, the Chinese hatred for European culture and civilization, end quote. Answer the supporters of the war. Yes, it is true the Chinese hate the Europeans, but which Europeans do they hate and why? The Chinese do not hate the European peoples. They have never had any quarrel with them. They hate the European capitalists and the European governments obedient to them. How can the Chinese not hate those who have come to China solely for the sake of gain, who have utilized their vaunted civilization solely for the purpose of deception, plunder, and violence, who have waged wars against China in order to win the right to trade in opium, with which to drug the people, the war of England and France with China in 1856, and who hypocritically carried their policy of plunder under the guise of spreading Christianity. The bourgeois governments of Europe have long been conducting this policy of plunder with respect to China, and now they have been joined by the autocratic Russian government. This policy of plunder is usually called a colonial policy. Every country in which capitalist industry develops rapidly has very soon to seek colonies, i.e., countries in which industry is weakly developed, in which a more or less patriarchal way of life still prevails, in which can serve as a market for manufactured goods and a source of high profits. For the sake of the profit of a handful of capitalists, the bourgeois governments have waged endless wars, have sent regiments to die in unhealthy tropical countries, have squandered millions of money extracted from the people, and have driven the people in the colonies to desperate revolts or to death from starvation. We need only recall the rebellion of the native peoples against the British in India and the famine that prevailed there, or think of the war the English are now waging against the Beers. And now, European capitalists have placed their rapacious paws upon China, and almost the first to do so was the Russian government, which now so loudly proclaims disinterestedness. It disinterestedly took Port Arthur away from China and began to build a railway to Manchuria under the protection of Russian troops. One after another, the European governments began feverishly to loot, as they put it, to rent Chinese territory, giving good grounds for the talk of partition of China. If we are to call things by their right names, we must say that the European governments, the Russian government among the very first, have already started to partition China. However, they have not yet begun this partitioning openly, but stealthily, like thieves. They began to rob China as ghouls rob corpse, and when the seeming corpse attempted to resist, they flung themselves upon it like savage beasts, burning down those villages, shooting and bayoneting and drowning in the Amur River unarmed inhabitants, their wives, and their children. All these Christians' exploits are accompanied by howls against the Chinese barbarians who dared to raise their hands against the civilized Europeans. The occupation of Neo-Chang and the moving of Russian troops into Manchuria are temporary measures, declares the autocratic Russian government in its circular note of August 12th of 1900, addressed to the powers. These measures, quote, are called forth exclusively by the necessity to repel the aggressive operation of Chinese rebels, end quote. They, quote, cannot in the least be regarded as evidence of any selfish plans which are totally alien in the policy of their imperial government, end quote. Poor imperial government, so Christianly unselfish, and yet so unjustly maligned. Several years ago, it unselfishly seized Port Arthur, and now it is unselfishly seizing Manchuria. It has unselfishly flooded the frontier provinces of China with hordes of contractors, engineers, and officers, who by their conduct have roused the indignation even the Chinese, known for their docility. The Chinese workers employed in the construction of the Chinese railway had to exist on a wage of 10 kopecks a day. Is this not unselfish on Russia's part? How is our government's senseless policy in China to be explained? Who benefits by it? The benefit goes to a handful of capitalist magnates who carry on trade with China, to a handful of factory owners who manufacture goods for the Asian market, to a handful of contractors who are now piling up huge profits on urgent war orders. Factories producing war equipment, supplies for the troops, etc., are now operating at full capacity and are engaging hundreds of new workers. This policy is a benefit to a handful of nobles who occupy high posts in the civil and military services. They need adventurous policies, for these provide them with opportunities for promotion, for making a career, and gaining fame by their exploits. In the interests of this handful of capitalists and bureaucratic scoundrels, our government unhesitatingly sacrifices the interests of the entire people. And in this case, as always, the autocratic Tsarist government has proved itself to be a government of irresponsible bureaucrats, severely cringing before the capitalist magnates and nobles. What benefits do the Russian working class and the laboring people generally obtain from the conquest in China? Thousands of ruined families whose breadwinners have been sent to the war, an enormous increase in the national debt, and the national expenditure mounting, taxation, greater power for the capitalists, the exploiters of the workers, whose worse conditions for the workers, still greater mortality among the peasantry, famine in Siberia. This is what the Chinese war promises and is already bringing. The entire Russian press, all the newspapers and periodicals are kept in a state of bondage. They dare not print anything without permission of the government officials. This is the reason for the lack of precise information as to what the Chinese war is costing the people. But there is no doubt that it requires the expenditure of many hundreds of millions of rubles. It has come to our knowledge that the government, by an unpublished decree, handed out the tidy sum of 150 million rubles for the purpose of waging the war. In addition to this, current expenditures on the war absorb 1 million rubles every 3-4 days, and these terrific sums are being squandered by a government, which, haggling over every kopeck, has steadily cut down grants to the famine-stricken peasantry, which can find no money for the people's education, which, like any kulak, sweats the workers in the government factories, sweats the lower employees in the post offices, etc. Minister of Finance Witt declared that on January 1st, 1900, there were 250 million rubles available in the treasury. Now this money is gone. It has been spent on the war. The government is seeking loans. Is increasing taxation, is refusing necessary expenditures because of the lack of money, and is putting a stop to the building of railways. The Tsarist government is threatened with bankruptcy, and yet it is plunging into a policy of conquest, a policy which not only demands the expenditure of enormous sums of money, but threatens to plunge us into still more dangerous wars. The European states that have flung themselves upon China are already beginning to quarrel over the division of the booty, and no one can say how this quarrel will end. But the policy of the Tsarist government in China is not only a mockery of the interests of the people. Its aim is to corrupt the political consciousness of the masses. Governments that maintain themselves in power only by means of the bayonet, that have constantly to restrain or suppress the indignation of the people, have long realized the truism that popular discontent can never be removed, and that it is necessary to divert the discontent from the government to some other object. For example, hostility is being stirred up against the Jews. The gutter press carries on Jew-baiting campaigns, as if the Jewish workers do not suffer in exactly the same way as the Russian workers from the oppression of capital and the police government. At the present time, the press is conducting a campaign against the Chinese. It is howling about the savage yellow race and its hostility towards civilization, about Russia's task of enlightenment, about the enthusiasm with which the Russian soldiers go into battle, etc., etc. Journalists who crawl their bellies before the government and the money bags are straining every nerve to rouse the hatred for the people against China. But the Chinese people have at no time and in no way oppressed the Russian people. The Chinese people suffer from the same evils as those from which the Russian people suffer. They suffer from an Asiatic government that squeezes taxes from the starving peasantry and that suppresses every aspiration towards liberty by military force. They suffer from the oppression of capital, which has penetrated into the Middle Kingdom. The Russian working class is beginning to move out of the state, a political oppression and ignorance in which the masses of the people are still submerged. Hence, the duty of all class-conscious workers is to rise with all their might against those who are stirring up national hatred and diverting the attention of the working people from their real enemies. The policy of the Tsarist government in China is a criminal policy, which is impoverishing, corrupting, and oppressing the people more than ever. The Tsarist government not only keeps our people in slavery, but sends them to pacify other peoples who rebel against their slavery, as was the case in 1849, when Russian troops suppressed the revolution in Hungary. It not only helps the Russian capitalists to exploit the Russian workers, whose hands it ties to hold them back from combining and defending themselves, but it also sends soldiers to plunder other peoples in the interests of a handful of rich men and nobles. There is only one way in which the new burden, the war is thrusting upon the working people can be removed, and that is the convening of an assembly of representatives of the people, which would put an end to the autocracy of the government and compel it to have regard for the interests other than those solely of a gang of courtiers. Okay. Yes, that's The War in China, written by Lenin and Iskra in 1900. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. A lot of stuff there is kind of relevant today. You know, they were attacking, just like who that rebellion turned into. You know, our government here in the U.S. is constantly attacking today with China bad, China bad, China bad. You know, and at that time, it was a rebellion against the government that our governments had. These colonial governments that we still have today had there. You know, they were trying to turn them into a colony like the U.S. is. So we still have this ignorance among, you know, the people here that are like, oh, China's doing all this, you know, as if, and they never learn from China. They never learn from what's needed in our society, you know, from, you know, different parts of the world. They want this to implode and implode and implode until they have no other option left but to shut the people up, not shut the people up, but shut the few groups of people that make money off of this stuff, and all the people who follow them around like they're a congregation in church. They'll have to shut them up. We have to, you know, there's a lot of leftist groups that do this too, a lot of leftist sects, you know, because they're more about left than about people and the people's revolution, you know. So if they used to say, oh, it's left to help spread imperialism, they're going to spread imperialism because it's left is the new good, you know, and right is the new bad if you're a left, you know. It's just we're right back at the church state again. So, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxist Saw. Y'all hit me up there. Y'all have a great day, and without